Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Please go down, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell so you always know when there's new content, new video coming up. Leave a comment if you have a comment to leave, or just no comment at all. Just leave us a emoticon. Go over to the About section. You can find Legend of Superstition Mountain Dutch Hunter Rendezvous shirts, black, gray, long sleeve, short sleeve. Speaking of all that, the Rendezvous coming up this week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, November 5th, 6th, and 7th at the Dons Camp. You can find it on Facebook and look it up, Dons of Arizona. If you're looking at it, it'll give you the dates and all the information you need. Please bring along a little bit of firewood because we'll be hanging around the campfire. We should be having our guest speakers in the amphitheater on Saturday night. They'll come up about dusk, all right? So that kind of be in there and all that. This next story I want to tell, it was something that I actually, for the last 3-4 weeks, kind of ran through my mind. It does take place in the Superstitions, but I was kind of working it over in my head and thinking, well, is it something really put on the channel? Because it's not my story. But it's one of those things that gets kind of stuck in your craw, and you have kind of a hard time working into something else because of that particular story. So therefore, I kind of went through it, and then I decided to contact the individual I'd heard it from and spoke to him. And, I told him, remember this, and he did. And we talked about it, and he basically said, if you don't use my name, use an alias for me. I don't have a problem with you telling this story. I've only told a couple people the story. And he said, I don't have no problem with you relating the story and so forth. He's not a Dutch hunter. He's not someone most everyone knows. If someone's heard the story or knows him, they'll recognize it. That's fine. They just he doesn't want his name out there and all. He has kind of watched the videos on the channel, and he said, yeah, I'd like to hear your take on the story. So kind of decided, well, maybe I will. And I still sat around for a couple weeks working it out in my head. So to begin with, how I met this individual, it was one of those people, once in a while when you're in the mountains, you'll be coming in or out of the mountains and you'll run into someone. You get that, there's that awkward thing where there's a couple trails will meet up and you end up on the same trail. And you're trying to figure out, well, I'm like 10 feet behind this guy. And we were walking out, I think the first time was probably the junction over by Bluff Springs and Whiskey Springs trails. And we kind of ended up coming out of the mountains. We ended up talking a little bit because there was that awkwardness, and then we ended up kind of chatting a bit and walking kind of side by side because there's just a lot of open nothing going all the way to the First Water parking lot. So we ended up having a bit of a conversation. And then there was, another time we were coming out of the mountains, and we ended up kind of, I remember he one time just sat down beside the trail and waited till I got over there. We talked a little and then just walked out together again talking. I got to know him, I don't think really well. We never actually went hiking, never went camping. He was not a Dutch hunter, he wasn't a treasure hunter or anyone like that. He wasn't just a hiker. He went back in the mountains to kind of one of the reasons I do at times, and I understood this, is just kind of let things get away, stop the clock. Go a place where there's no time and just day and night, and kind of whatever you're looking for. And sometimes that, with the busy schedule in life, looking to get stuff out. I don't know about his personal life. I didn't know anything about that. He never explained his troubles. I just knew he went back and he spent time in the mountains. And sometimes he'd ask about different areas because he'd go back and do stuff like that. There was a time we were coming out of the mountains, and John, who is what I'm going to refer to him as, is coming out, and we had actually ran into each other in the parking lot at, I think it was First Water. And I went over just to say hi, and we talked for a few, and he said, hey, you got a few minutes? And I was like, yeah. And he said, I got something I want to run by you. And he proceeded to tell me this story. Now, this had happened, I think, a while before that. So it wasn't like that trip or something. It was something that he'd been kind of working over, and I always got the feel for that. I've never really asked him. I know it wasn't that trip because of where he'd been, and he talked about that for a few minutes, where he'd been back and where he'd been camped. But this story had happened previously, and I think it was one of those things where he kind of like let it digest, and he kind of tried to work it out and try to understand what it meant. And there's a little paraphrasing. I don't think embellishment would be a word for it, but paraphrasing on my part, trying to remember things or what he was thinking. But I recently, having spoken to him, I can get it down pretty well. So he told me he came out and he wanted to make a trip out in the mountains, spend a couple nights. And he didn't want to go way back in too far, too much into the interior. But he wanted to find a place he could kind of get out and get away from everybody and set up camp. And I took that as like usual, life's kind of getting to you. I don't know. He was probably 8-10 years older than me. Well, still is, because he's alive. But I don't know if he was ever married. He had kids. None of this stuff. I don't think we've ever talked about it. I don't think he's ever mentioned things about it. So, again, it's kind of like, the personal side of things I don't really know much about. But I know when he talked about the mountains and stuff. So he'd come back and he went back into this area, and he said he wanted to go up around the base of some mountains, and he wanted to have a camp where he could look to the east, but he'd have a good view of the sunsets to the west. He'd have a nice view to the south and to the north, so wherever he was, he could walk around and would have a particular unobstructed, really nice view of the mountains, and that was it. And he said he went out, found a nice campsite, and it had some good high ground in case it rained or anything, and he felt like he was in a good spot and set up his camp. So he set up this camp, and he had a tent, and he cooked, and he said he kind of had a nice little camp, and he was kind of sitting there. And the first night he went, he had his dinner, put everything away, and he said he thought he heard something like a drum, but he couldn't tell. And the mountains can carry sound from a very far, from a distance. I've known this, like when Randy and I would be back in the mountains, and I know one particular incident, we were up in Bluff Springs. There was no one on top of Bluff Springs, but there was someone down in Needle Canyon, and I could tell someone down there was smoking a cigarette. And I could just smell it because I hadn't had a cigarette for an hour or so, and I could really pick up that smell. And it's kind of odd, like that sound is very similar too, so you don't know where it's traveling from. And sometimes you don't even know what it is. It could be some guy banging on the hood of his car or something, for all you know. But he said it was somewhat rhythmic, and it would disappear, and he got up and actually kind of stood outside and tried to listen to it, and it wouldn't be there. And then he would sit, go to get ready to go back in, and he'd hear it faintly, but he couldn't come up with a direction. Couldn't come up with anything. He kind of lost interest in it. He said the one thing was he was trying to figure out if it was in his head or if it was outside. And I think some people understand this. Sometimes you'll get that kind of like, you'll hear something and it'll kind of get in your side of your head, and maybe it's a song or something like that. And you can actually hear something in your head because of the white noise, the ringing in your ears, being out in such a quiet area. And you'll think you're hearing something, and you really aren't. He wasn't sure what it was. He didn't bother him. He just realized there's nobody around, and I'm not really hearing this clearly. So he kind of was dismissive of it, went back in, lay down, went to sleep. Got up the next day, cooked breakfast, went out for a walk for a while. Not much else to speak of. He said, he was having a nice trip. The next thing that happened, and he thought it was unusual, is he was making his dinner. He said he had frozen a steak, wrapped it up in foil, and it had thawed out a bit, so he was going to cook that steak that second night. And he said he was cooking the steak, and he was putting things together, and he looked up, and there was a coyote. And he said it was odd because the coyote was just sitting there, and it just kind of was looking at him, and he was cooking and taking care of things. He said the coyote was probably 40 yards off, 50 yards off, and it just sat there. And it was kind of like watching him with interest, like, what are you doing? And he said it just sat there. It didn't do anything. It didn't move. And he continued, and he got his steak done, and he said he ate. He kind of pulled back, finished eating, got ready to clean up, realized he had some fat and stuff from the steak, and he looked out, and I think he said he had some biscuits or something he made up. And so he decided to take a plate, and He took it on the plate and walked out a little distance, about 10-15 yards, and he said he found a flat rock and he set the pieces of steak and some of the bread biscuit out there, and he just set it there. And then he walked back and went to clean up still. And he said he just kind of watched the coyote didn't get up and leave when he got up. It didn't, just sat there. So he just kind of dismissed it and was curious if it would come, but he knew he couldn't watch it. It wouldn't come up if he watched it. So he went to getting everything together and just went about his business. And then when he got done, he sat down, started to roll a cigarette, and he said he looked out, and the coyote was still in the same spot, but he looked down, and there was none of the food on the rock. So the coyote had crept up, ate, went back, and then sat, he said, literally in the same spot. It didn't look like it had moved. And he thought it was kind of odd and unusual. Then he worried a little that the coyote's going to continue to come back, because he'd fed it. Now he's going to have a problem with the coyote kind of sitting around his camp, or will he have more than one coyote in his camp because he's fed one? So he said he talked to it for a while. Didn't seem to react to his voice or anything. He didn't want to shoo it away or do anything because he thought that would have been, kind of like a wrong gesture, especially since he'd been acting somewhat friendly and actually gave it some food. And he kind of believed in kind of doing that right thing the right way. So he just figured he would eventually get to the point he would ignore it. Kind of built up his fire a little just to sit by the fire. He probably had some coffee or something, another cigarette or two, sitting there by the fire. The sun went down and just relaxing and enjoying. And he said he just eventually looked up and the coyote was gone. He said he never noticed the motion, coyote walking away. He said he would have thought it would have kind of like caught his eye since he was facing and the coyote his tent was behind him, his fire, and then the coyote was out in front of him. But he said he thought it was there for so long it just became something part of the landscape. And he said he looked up and it was just gone. And he didn't think anything of it. Just kind of thought, okay, well, coyote's gone. And he kind of wrapped things up, and then it was time to go to bed again. So he kind of made sure his coals went down, got inside his tent. He said he went to sleep. Said he was pretty tired. He did a lot of walking. He said he never went looking for anything. There wasn't anything in particular. He'd kind of discover things. And I know a couple guys like that. They love being in the mountains. They feel really at home in the mountains. They feel a part of the mountains, but they're not necessarily treasure hunters, Dutch hunters. They know some of the stories and stuff. They'll read books. They will go out to sites that interest them and stuff. But it's more of a, and I understand this because I have a lot of that in me too, is just kind of, why would someone sit here and mine? Why would they spend their camp? And you kind of like look at the psychology a little, but I think for him too, it was just kind of feeling the history and walking in other people's paths and things. Like I said, when we would talk, he would ask me questions about things and about different areas. Sometimes I didn't know, sometimes I'd been there and knew. And he never gave me a report like whether he went there or not. I only found out sometimes where he was going if I ran into him when he was coming out. So, but he went to sleep, and he said he was pretty tired, so he just almost instantly fell asleep, very relaxed, and fell asleep for the night. John goes to sleep, and he wakes up, and he can hear those drums again. And he kind of was listening to it, and it seemed like it was in the distance, but this time he could hear it kind of steadily. It was coming and going. He said it was like, it wasn't breezy out, wasn't a wind, but it was like ebbing and flowing. And he listened for a while and realized he actually was hearing something. Got out, said there was quite a bit of moonlight. The moon was probably over 3/4 full. So he was able to kind of like see pretty well in the dark, decided not to grab a flashlight. He said it was clear sky night, nice and cool. And he decided to kind of like see if he could kind of tell where that was coming from without traveling too far. He wasn't going to walk miles, but he figured he'd walk around and see if he could hear where it was coming from, because he found it curious how the ebb and flow of it would go. It seemed like it got a little louder, but it got a little lower, like it was moving. And he said that's what he'd noticed the night before. So he starts walking across the desert and the area, and he's looking around, and he said, the weird thing is over into the mountains, everything, the shadows, the shapes. He says it was just almost beautiful. Said he wasn't tired anymore. He kind of had his interest, and he got up, and he said he was kind of traveling southwest, and he came up, and he ended up on the edge of where there was a wash. He looked down, and the wash was probably 8-10 feet below him. And he stood there quietly, and he said then he saw 3 coyotes. He said there was one in the lead, and then 2 others following it close behind, not side by side, but kind of. And he said what made him curious was they were just walking. He said they weren't doing the trot, they weren't like in a hurry, because most of the time you see coyotes or anything, animals, you see them generally on the move, like they have business somewhere. And he said these just kind of seemed to be just walking along very slowly, very quietly. He said they never looked up, the one was out in the front by maybe 5 or 10 feet, and then the other 2 a little staggered next to each other walking behind it. And he said he couldn't tell if it was one of them was the same coyote he saw the other day, but he thought the behavior was different. He said you don't often get to see the animals when they're totally relaxed, not hunting, just kind of in a very mellow, what you would see a domestic dog really do coming in from the backyard. They're very relaxed and all that. You don't see that in the wild as much, because usually the animals are kind of aware something's in the area, can smell something or whatnot. So he kind of saw them traveling down this wash, and he realized when he got there also he could tell this noise was kind of coming from the direction they were traveling. So he decided to kind of stay up on that edge and walk along there and see what he could find. So John walked along this edge of this ridge over the wash, and he said he came to a spot where it kind of divided. It was like a Y. And he said it was like the main wash came down and then it split into 2 sections. There was a narrower wash, a smaller tributary that went southwest, but then there was a bigger one. But in this area, and people know when you get into those junctions, there's kind of an open space there. It's usually a sandy area and it's kind of open and stuff. And he said there was some rocks and boulders, but as he got there and he started getting closer to that spot, he could see the glow of yellow. And he realized there must be a fire down in there. And so he got very cautious, very quiet, kind of moved up slowly. He said at that point he was probably about 15 to 20 feet above. It was a little higher area. It was like it got deeper down to that one section. And he came up and started to look, get through the bushes and tried to be very quiet to look down to see what was there. And what he saw, actually, while he could hear it, but surprised him a great deal. What John told me he saw was they had a bit of a bonfire. He said the flames were probably 3 to 4 feet tall. It was in the center of this sandy area. There were 3 people up front. There was one in the center and 2 kind of slightly behind him standing up front talking. He said he thought some of the words and he couldn't hear them really well because they were down below him and there was this drum going. But he could hear them talking, and some of it sounded like English, and he could make out a word occasionally in English, but then some of it didn't sound like anything English. It didn't sound like Spanish or German or anything he'd ever heard. So he was kind of listening to it, and he said all 3 of these guys up in the front were wearing like tan pants and stuff, and they weren't really wearing shirts. And he couldn't visualize them from where he was, see them, but he couldn't tell, but he said they looked like they were doing some kind of ritual, and he couldn't figure it out. And he said there was a drummer that was off to the back, and it was like a kettle drum of some sort. And the person was playing the kettle drum, and it would be soft for a while. And he understood that was the ebb and flow, was a little because it was in the wash. But he said as well, this person would start playing it very, very low, where you could barely hear it. And then it would rise up at a certain point. Now, he said these 3 people were in the middle there in front of the fire. But he said off to the left and right of them, there were 2 individuals that were wearing tan pants or something. And he said those 2 individuals were kind of looking around. They were looking down the washes and looking around and turning and just looking. They were just kind of like they were guards. And their role was to keep an eye out in case someone was coming or something was approaching. Of course, he didn't see the coyotes. He never told me that. I never asked about that. Did you ever see the coyotes in there? So anyways, he kind of he was watching it, very interested, but he said then in front of them, there might have been 15 to 20 people, and they were dressed various ways, and he said they seemed very normal, but they were dressed in jackets and shirts and flannel shirts and stuff, and he said they were all down below him, and he could just kind of see their shadows. He couldn't really, they were kind of because they were in the front of the fire and then down below him, he said it was just shadow shapes, but he could see there was quite a few of them. Some were sitting on rocks, some were standing up, some were sitting in the sand, and they were there. And he kind of observed and watched this, he said, for quite some time, and he said it was totally puzzling, because he said it had a ritual kind of thing to it, but he wasn't sure what it meant. So John said, I didn't know what to do, and I started moving forward, and then he said he thought he must have been silhouetted against the moon, because one of the guys on the edge just kind of jerked and then started looking up there, and he said he could tell he noticed thought he saw movement, but he wasn't sure what he saw, and he was like very kind of scanning. So he said, I kind of ducked down, and he said I got down and literally sat on the ground in this brush, but I couldn't really see very clearly anymore. I could still hear, and I could hear that drum, and he said I would hear them talking, and they would alternate talking, and he said I didn't hear much, and he said no one else spoke, and he said I stayed down like that for a very long time, and he said, the fire's going and all this, and he said I was worried about sticking my head up. So he said what I tried to do is figured I would back out very slowly, crawl out, and get around to a different position where I might be able to get some visibility, but I would kind of be in a different area and have better cover, because he said I think the moon was kind of, definitely kind of silhouetted me up there. So he said he got around, worked his way around, and, then things got quiet. And he said he was working his way. He probably went back 30, 40, 50 yards and worked his way around to another spot where he'd have a different view down. And he said he got to there, and when he got there, all the noise had stopped. And he said when he looked down, there was embers of a fire, and there were no people there. And he just felt spooked, like, did he spook something? Did he cause something? Did he cause them to leave? Were they looking for him? He said now he figured whatever they were doing, they probably just finished up, kind of threw some dirt, kind of tamped down the fire, and then they left. And they would have traveled to the south, the opposite direction. He was working his way around north. But he said at the time he was very, very paranoid, thought he kind of was witnessing something he shouldn't. He kind of come around, and then he thought, well, I don't know what I'm even looking at. And he said, did I break up this ritual? Were those two guys on the end? Are they kind of looking for me now? And all this stuff. So he kind of just decided he wasn't going to kind of mess with this or fool with this anymore, and started to slowly back out and decided he was leaving. He would come down and check the area in the morning. So that was his big deal. I'll come back down here and check and make sure I'm not even imagining this. Now, like most of us, he gets back to camp and he can't sleep because he's trying to process this all. And he said that was a big thing for him, is working it through his head. Did he understand it? Was there anything familiar about it? He said he wasn't sure if it was some sort of Native American thing or was some sort of other ritual. He said there was nothing about it he could pick up on. He said it seemed something like out of a movie or something, but he said he also had to think about that he was probably viewing it because he was very apprehensive and not sure what he was looking at, and very surprised at it being there in the middle of nowhere. He said there was no sacrifice or nothing like that. Those guys just kept talking. And so he kind of was like, and I kept, when he told it to me, I asked him, I said, okay, so, and he drew out how everybody was standing and stuff. And I nodded, and he said he really worried that maybe he was kind of imagined it or something like that. He said he was making sure, but he figured he'd go down in the morning and check it out. And he said by the time he went to sleep, he actually started a fire and put the fire together, and he kind of sat there for a while in the dark waiting, because he said he kept thinking somebody was watching him. And he said but he knew that was he thought they had seen him, and he was pretty sure by the time he went to bed nobody had seen him, nobody had come around, he hadn't heard anything in the dark. The fire had burned down. If you're going to let the fire go down, I'll go back in my tent, I'll catch some sleep, and I will get up in the morning when it's light out, and I will go down there and I'm going to check this place out. So he figured the fire was pretty much down and everything was about out, and he just went in, and he said it took him a little while. He was listening, like all of us would, right? We'd all be out there kind of okay, do I hear anything? Do I hear anything? And he said finally he fell asleep. And he said it was pretty late. It was probably 11 or 12 o'clock, which the sun goes down earlier during the winter, which is when he probably was out there. So it had been kind of a long night for him since he'd got up with the sunrise. So he fell asleep, and he said he was sleeping well until something woke him. So he woke up because he saw light, and it kind of startled him, and he didn't think it was morning. He thought it'd been late, but did I sleep that well that the sun's coming up? And he opened the flap of his tent, and he got up and looked out, and his fire's going. and there was wood on the fire. And he kind of came out and looked around. There was nobody around. He hadn't heard anything, but he said he was sleeping pretty deep. And then he was very paranoid. So he kind of looked at it, realized, I don't know, did I think the fire was out? Did I put wood on it? And then thinking the fire was out and that would start in the morning. And then he said he was questioning himself. Then he was even questioning what he'd seen earlier. And he said he got himself kind of mixed up and realized he was completely defeating the purpose of why he'd come out in the mountains. And he was trying to figure all this out in his head. And he said he wasn't comfortable with going out and walking around looking in the moonlight. He let the fire kind of go down a bit low, kept feeding it. He said he was up probably for another hour or so, feeding some sticks into the fire, keeping it going, just listening intensely. He really didn't want to be in the tent with the tent shut and somebody was out there. At the same token, he didn't want to be walking out there not knowing how many people, since he'd seen this group of people. And he said it really just kind of played with him. And he said, I don't know if that was their intention or anything, but he said it really messed with me, and I couldn't even think if I put wood on the fire or if I'd done something like that. And he said, now I'm just kind of a bundle of nerves, and I decided to go back to sleep. So he laid himself back. He said he literally just ended up with the tent flaps open, laying back with the fire and throwing a stick in, and he fell asleep. So he was trying to keep himself awake, but he was so tired he fell asleep, laying there with the tent flaps open. And he did wake up in the morning. He was safe and sound. He said he got up in the morning, put some wood on, started the fire up, started cooking breakfast, looking around. He said he did get up. He said he's not much of a person for tracking or anything, but he did look around to see if he could find any footprints but then his, because he said it would seem, since he'd been around camp enough and the dirt was trampled enough, if there was any other imprint other than his foot, it would show up. And he said he found nothing. So he figured he'd been there all night and it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but it was still strange to him. So at that point, he decided, well, I'm going to go down and look at that spot where everything had been. And he decided to go down there, and he figured I'll look and I'll see a bunch of boot trip prints and stuff like that, and I'll just check it all out, see where that fire pit was and all this stuff, and everything will be there. And he said that I'll just kind of know these people were there, they did this thing there, and maybe they come out there periodically to do whatever they're doing. Maybe I interrupted it, maybe I didn't, but I'll just put that back in my mind and not worry about it. And he said at that point, a lot of things were bothering him. The incidents with the coyotes, and that they were heading that direction and all this stuff. And he says, I'm starting to get this weirdness kind of wrapped up. So he says, I walk down there, I get down there. And he said, when I got there, the rock and the rings, fire pit, all that stuff was gone. He says, now, I found burnt pieces of wood down there. So he says, I could tell there was a fire there. And I dug around a little in the sand, and I could see where the coals were, where the charcoal was. So he said they basically cleaned that spot up. He said he walked around. He really couldn't find, there had been so much activity in there. He said he could see all kinds of animal trails. And he said different impressions in the sand in different places. But it was hard to really tell like anything specific. It looked like there'd been a ton of traffic. So he felt like there was enough there to show him these people had been there, they'd had a fire, but then after he'd went back, they must have come out, a group of them, and cleaned everything up and straightened everything up. So now he's thinking those guys were coming up, and then they knew he had been camped, and they went to his camp, and he's not sure if to mess with him or what, but to build his fire. So he was like, but does that make any sense? And what was this? So he kind of was like trying to let it all be and everything else. And when he went and was telling me the story, he said, do you think I ran into some skinwalkers or something and some type of witchcraft? And I said, I don't know if it was anything like that, because I've never heard of a gathering like that, of something like that. Generally in that type of situation, it's considered solitary. He said he tried to actually reach out to a couple people, but with Navajo and other people, it's kind of like something they don't want to talk about, because they feel if they talk about it, then it can bring it to them, and it's kind of a bad luck thing if we're going to talk about it. So they dismissed it and said, I don't think that's anything, but no, we're not going to talk about that. But they basically also said they don't know what he saw. They said it didn't, who knows what he was watching and all. Now, the funny thing is that I actually do know what he saw that night. Well, thanks for joining me for this story on John's trip into the mountains. It was very different. It was kind of a different Superstition Mountains story, and I generally, I leave it to these other guys to tell about other people's stories. I generally like to tell my side of the story. Sometimes my opinion and thoughts on, interjected with a particular story, or tell stories that I'm involved with, attached to. I know the people, or I was somehow involved in a little deeper. And I'm not particular one who wants to tell someone else's story. I think they do that so much better. And that's why I always hope we could do some interviews or do some things, or have some people that do some storytelling come in here and do a few. The rendezvous, there's going to be a few people might question me on this, and I'm probably, if someone comes up and kind of has the answer and asks me and mentions it, I hope that they will just keep their lips sealed. And if they mention it, I'll let them know if they have it right, nailed on the head. And I don't have a problem with that, but because I think if they know and they understand it, then they're going to be understanding of why I'm not saying anything more about it. But it was a very real thing, and very real things sometimes can cause you to have a very different view. And we're talking about someone that basically thought he almost dreamed it, and then kept trying to coordinate everything that was happening around him. The coyotes down in the wash, the fire burning, coming back, and all that type of stuff integrated with this. Now, he never had another incident like that. We had talked about it, and I kind of assumed right in the beginning. I never really checked with anyone concerning that if something had happened out there. I never went and investigated. I kind of just figured it out of what he said. I kind of understood it and kind of realized what it was, and tried to just reassure him is, don't let that ever bother you. If you ever see it again, just sit back and watch, and you're not going to understand it, but enjoy yourself for what it is. That being said and done, I hope everybody enjoyed this video. I had a great time doing it. Like I said, it was a bit different because I was telling someone else's story, but it got, I know everybody gets that point where something gets stuck, and you're like, I got to get around this story and maybe get it out. And I thought about maybe it would work at the rendezvous. I would tell it at the rendezvous around a campfire. But I had a couple more of these to film before I got to the rendezvous, and I thought, yeah, but now I'm hung up. I got these other things in my head, but every time I try to think of them and prepare my head and make sure, well, okay, is this story or that story? This story keeps pushing to the forefront. So I guess it was a story or something I just felt like I had to tell. I don't know why, but when they do that and they kind of surface and kind of push themselves forward at you, you just take it for what it is. It's just like if you pick something up off the ground and you feel like this feeling of like you should just put that back, put it back. This story just wanted to be told. Getting a frog in my throat. Had a long day working, a lot of dust and stuff. Anyhow, hope to see everybody at the rendezvous. If I do, come over, say hello. Maybe we'll talk about things, some other stories and stuff. But I'm looking forward to seeing everybody there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday next week. I hope everybody had a great Halloween, and this was my belated Halloween story. Not really spooky, not really paranormal, but kind of fitting, I think, in some way, the aftermath of that going into November and the cooler months. So, until the next time, we join ourselves again shortly after the rendezvous, which I will be doing in the next day or so. Hopefully that my block is cleared through. I'm Wayne Tuttle, you're not, and this was Chasing Legends. Have a great week, and see you next time.